the religion of Hermeticism or Gnosticism or the act of knowing or the use of secret knowledge or the fruit of knowledge of good and evil generates the assumption of the satanic subversion of the legitimate functions of how society is to be constructed and an organized and legal system, which consistently subverts itself by the existence of the secrecy, and the compounding secrecy generates a hierarchy of various stacking wizards who are actively encouraged to defraud those who do not have their degree of knowledge, at which point can be extorted as serfs who are ignorant and thus vulnerable. Girls who fall for boys' cons actively encourage the existence of the boys who engage in the use of the cons, which justifies the existence of the con to the boys who use it under the rationality because they fall for it. It must be legitimate, and thus their permission is the fact that they get away with it, which is the foundation of many of the rape culture principles, which actively generates the position of vulnerability and traps and subversions as they're systematically looking to trade for something while not having the capacity to trade with those trading as terrorists who not seeking the exchange of an actual um, transfer of the exchange of legitimate equivalent value good faith trades, but rather the extortions of the acts of taking for distribution to their interest and then the discarding once they've been satisfied under the interest is fundamentally to be built as an extension of the religion of the Satanists, loyal to the terrorist subversion of rights, who systematically construct these systems specifically for the extortions, for the robberies, for the thefts, for the murders, for the lies, for the defamations, in the forming of the Hell Society. Now you understand that the practice of everything that the God of the Bible hates, being functionally the foundation of the religion of the Gnostics, generates a standard compulsion to the normalization of the arrogant eye, the lying tongue, the hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked schemes, feet that are quick to rush into evil, a false witness who pours out lies, a man who stirs up dissension amongst the brothers. They, claiming that the God of the Bible is the devil, get to be everything that God hates as the God of the Bible's devil, as each of them are pointing to each other, saying, "Nah, the other one is." They systematically compound these subversions. So as you follow into the system of the secret subversions, of the fruit of the poison tree, into the subversions of the war criminals, into the policies of the subversion of the rights of the laws of nature designed by the God of nature, you manifest your loyalties to either the biblical God or to the satanic God under these principles. If your leading arrangement is the extortion advantage to be able to compel others by the leverage of the fraud, then in the subjugation, in the dominance, in the violence, you have asserted yourselves as the enemy of the God of nature. And the infinite division of that society is insurmountably self-destructive and turns against each other as to not be able to be reliable by each other, as their core identity is the division itself, and a house divided against itself cannot stand, and thus it is built on a house of sand. It is built on fraud. It is built on subversion of the collective ambition in favor of the individual interest of whichever wizard is manufacturing the specific spell. So it is essential when dealing with these types of things to have sunlight be the best disinfectant. Make base reality the standard principle. Make the truth the standard principle. Make discovery the standard principle. Make the acknowledgement of the fraud in order to investigate the subversion and solve the illusion the base principle. At which point, when you engage in reasonable doubt and you pursue the string of logic to the natural conclusions, you then can subvert all of the tricks, and in the act of subverting the trick, you no longer justify the norm of the existence of trying to defraud you, as the successful fraud against you is the thing that justifies its generation. So the more you react to people who are harassing you, under somebody else's title, for instance, if they're on somebody's account and they're harassing you and your retaliation is against somebody else who they want to have injured, then the act of the legal concept of defamation has been enacted, at which point your retaliation against the defamation, against the wrong target, pays the offender a compounding quantity of times the various resources they're looking to expand on, at which point it being normalized in the espionage civil war is reproduced infinitely as a standard operating procedure, as their core identity requires the normalization of the compounding interest of those frauds destroying the general public, and their successes are the confirmation that it is not only just and right, but necessary to do, as the capacity to do it is the alternative to legitimate services, which, if you're going to work in a competent, stable society, you find a service to the community and you do that thing. At which point, they, instead of doing competent, stable, good faith, desirable work, do those cons instead, as the core of their value is the subversion of the general public in the thefts and subversions and sorceries from their defamations and robberies and murders, etc. With friends like that, who needs enemies? And that is the foundational principle of the Hell Society. It's important to understand that the Satanists, or the people who support the one world Satan government from Revelation, are founded on many different perspectives, including the Gnostic position of being against sexuality or ejaculation, at which point the generation of the Bible that says that the Antichrist has a perversion but is not sexually attracted to women is fundamentally natural to these series of religions, which are culminating in the infection of the general society, passing them off as their adversary, as the corruption and manipulation requires the infiltration of the church and others in order to create permission of the precedent of their enemy to themselves, proving the superiority of themselves by having co-signed from the enemy. At which point, the Christians who support life, by definition, also understand that God, having created sex, have exponentially supported this existence in its proper legitimate process. And the Gnostics, in those arrangements, under their worship of Satan, have actively sought the destruction of sexuality and the perversion of sexuality and the control and tyrannical nature of these engagements in order to compel compliance in their favor, as the support of the extortionary abuse systems, such as the schools in Utah, which are abusing their children, are actively protected by the government, and many of the other arrangements, like the Yellow Cafe or whatever. Many of these arrangements are actively the hyper advanced position of the natural state of the Gnostics, who, actively pretending to be Christian, are only using the veneer of Christianity to enforce their Gnosticism without being disrupted, as defrauding the general public is fundamental to their mental objectives. The act of having accomplished the con successfully is the permission to do the con, is the justification of reproducing more of that service and that kind, at which point those abuses being fundamental to the Satanists are exponentially done under the defamatory system of pretending to be Christian while being its enemy, at which point those who then condemn Christianity on the basis of the Satanist operations exponentially prove the viability of the strategy of those infections, at which point the church exponentially becoming more and more vulnerable to the manipulation into the support of abuse over grace, of punishment, of vengeance instead of grace and mercy and advancements and rehabilitation and love and development into the competent mechanisms celebrated inside the Bible under its doctrines are exponentially subverted by not those doctrines, as it is infected by its enemies who conducting the position of staged secret knowledge, such as the advancements of classifications, are actively using these systems of secret knowledge to advance their religion under other parties' accounts, exponentially extorting them for higher and higher promotions and resources, including the normalization of compromising the government, as the use of government classification is the assertion of the Gnostics' protection of staged classified knowledge, asserting their ability to engage in the cons and abuses normalized and reproduced throughout the public by those systems as a standard function of their religious practices to abuse the things that remind them of God. The female Gnosticism, or toxic femininity, has actively developed its position to collectivize the management of children, which generates the systematic removal of parents' rights, manufacturing the vulnerability of the general public into the centralized confusion of their Gnostic compounding injury, such as in California, where they are capturing children and actively using the secret knowledge in order to trick them into believing that they should be transitioned, whereas the public record doesn't show what their secret functions of the wizardry is, at which point the edited narrative for the public record shows that the child who doesn't know any better as a small child needs to become transitioned or become homosexual or be considered the opposite sex or some random thing that they come up with, which is fully arbitrary as a mechanism, as in many of their use of secrets includes the poisonings or the use of surveillance technology in order to manipulate the baseline structure, at which point the side effects of what's being done to them is the thing that they're experiencing, is the thing that they're acknowledging. So the act of having been targeted is the thing that they've affirmed, at which point the affirmative care reinforces the thing that they're being targeted with. So all of the things that they're affirming is the fact that they are a target in order to be manipulated by criminal coercion by the Gnostic sorcerer, which actively has to deny it in favor of their secrecy, or the jig is up, at which point their exponential cons can no longer be conducted, including their use of the radicalization of the churches, which exponentially increasing in historic positions of being used, such as the KKK Gnostics in the church, who compromise various memberships of it, including pastoral roles, who use the function of violence in secret in order to retaliate against those functions, are actively retaliating against the existence of someone having been targeted. At which point, the position from Lindsey Graham and others who want the justification of being able to target anyone to remove any rights for any reason whatsoever, including race, is the function of the wizards engaging in the mechanism of the spell for any arbitrary threat. So when they create a homosexual and then they hire out or find members of the public who are against homosexuality to go out and harass and abuse and torment them, then the person who isn't a homosexual who's just been targeted is continuing to be physically violated by other members who are retaliating against them being a target, which funds having targeted them and funds having targeted other people, encouraging the increase of the quantity of how many people are targeted in those particular ways until it reaches its zenith power and becomes normalized to the general public. So the more you abuse them, the more you oppress them on the basis of being targeted, the more you normalize and justify the permission of the existence of that action in the general public. At which point, the homosexuals, having been oppressed too much, were created too much, at which point they became enough of the population that they were able to establish their ability to gain a foothold in the general public and started gaining momentum on their rights. At which point you understand the function in the downfall of humanities or the downfall of empires or societies actively has the increase of these functions, such as Jonathan Carr's Harbingers, which acknowledges the social perversions which are exponentially increased whenever society is getting close to its collapsed state, which is the use of those wizard spells from those secret societies and government classified functions, which is accelerating those types of personality effects by the manipulation of the wizards, which are being oppressed, which is generating the funding mechanism to create more of the targeted effect, at which point these things become a majority and then it begins to collapse, at which point the subject has nothing to do with whether or not they're homosexual or any other thing such as a transsexual or any other Gnostic objective of destroying their sexuality, as the engagement of having targeted him for the manipulation generates the normalization as it the abuse of the targeted subject is the permission on maturity of its existence to exist and flourish in the general public. You are funding the thing you pretend to attack under the Hegelian dialectic. You have pendulum which swings in both ways, at which point the wizards know how to skip by and miss the pendulum swing on both directions, at which point this is just a breeding scenario in order to have exponentially increased X, Y, or Z substances. So whatever it is they pretend to be attacking is the thing they're trying to develop or create more of, increasing the population of whatever target subject they are pretending to be opposed to. They are funding its creation and solidification inside the general public. I eat because I'm fat, and I'm fat because I eat is basically the mentality of what they're doing. At which point, if you're going to fall for the con, you are giving them permission and accelerating their mentality and eagerness to pursue that specific fraud. You are telling them to do it more, not less. You are not opposing it. You are creating it. If you want to not get fat, if you don't want to eat to become fat and be fat to become someone who eats a lot, you have to slim up, you have to fix your diet, you have to do your exercise, you have to change the mentality of the baseline structure. You have to stop consuming in the specific way which is causing the problem, being the source of the own injury is the maintenance of what their manufacturer in these services by classified functions is doing, at which point you have to be smart about how you want to get rid of it. You have to acknowledge it in the non-payment to the people making it way. Any policy or custom without reason is fraud, and thus you must investigate what the crimes are, and thus you must create solutions that are not funding the underlying current from the black market, creating that source material. At which point, whatever you're doing from the government, which is creating more on the basis of creating a distraction for targets, such as the military's desire to abuse the general public. It, in 1983, uh, got permission to violate the law by threatening judges into intimidating them into accepting threats against the general public, at which point the use of power is over the use of law. Their position is a position over law. They're a wizard over law. There is not equal justice under law from 1983 policy from the judges. And this is derived as a matter of fact in the use of using those abuses to create secret simulations which generates the manufacture of the thing viewed in the general public, at which point the only solution to that thing is the affirmation of the target as a target to be freed of that thing, to be secure in their person, their papers, and their effects, and to keep the government out of the bedroom, which was specifically, aggressively, and maliciously ignored even after it was passed to protect the homosexuals. At which point, there is no solution until you're able to force them to comply with these base agreements of the rule of law in a law and order competent, stable society. If your cure for bondage is bondage, then it is a trick in order to destroy the group, as the false arrest is the primary objective. But if your cure to bondage is liberty, then the function becomes restoration and rehabilitation through the series of competent policies which facilitate the acknowledgement of secrets, such as those from false experiments of those engaged in the Gnostic Satanist religion inside the military and intelligence communities loyal to Hitler Nazism, which, having been ingested by Project Overcast and Project Paperclip, is a trackable, understood function inside the United States, which has exponentially created and advanced eugenics positions for the destruction of reproduction, including the one cited by Justice Ginsburg, who said that she supported uh, abortion and wanted to attach it to some kind of socially accepted Medicare system in order to limit undesirable members of the public, at which point those who are artificially generated by the wizard communists into becoming poor are asserted as less desirable in the system which celebrates stability, wealth, and order, at which point the destabilized are the unfavored. The poor, having artificially been generated, are the unfavored, at which point the reproduction of their ending of their lines by the use of killing their infants as a strategy by the white nationalists to convince them that sacrificing their children for their wealth, like the rest of the witches, warlocks, and sorcerers from the Nazi structure, are actively doing the same, except against the larger structures. At which point, you might give a personal sacrifice of your child and they might give a personal sacrifice of somebody else's wealth, some other community's wealth, some other large structure's wealth, at which point the act of having conducted these systems exponentially compounds the structure of the greater the sacrifice, the greater the projected returns on the promised wealth under their worship of the devil, which materially observes their incentivization of increasing their wealth by the sacrificing of the innocent by increasing prison populations under that sacrifice system, including the abuse structure of targeted individuals who have not been captured by the cops or the slave raiders yet, exponentially increases the quantity of value derived by the promise of that sacrifice. So therefore, the act of barring them from those restraints, from their subversions, from their communist uh, breaking of the free market and rights in general, as their ignoring of rights being more and more restrained and punished, generates the act of liberty or the gift of Christ to all men, generated as the laws of nature by the God of nature to assert life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and its subordinate rights, such as the right of human decency, as essential to the rights of life or existence. At which point, those things not being subverted facilitates your exit out of artificially ingested addictions, such as the addictions into the narcotics, which are actively infested by the intelligence communities who are compelling the sale of those products into the general public by the use of their secret functions of the government in order to engage in the compelled sales or armed robbery, uh, doing a takings of the money in favor of giving them the narcotics, at which point you have the act of forced ingestion, which is actively reproduced by the CIA and other institutions, such as the active acid drops inside uh, each other's drinks and general members of the public for arbitrary targeting for malicious permanent gang stalking abuses, which generates the permanent state of systematic injury and abuse in their ritual behavior, which, as a function of the religion, is a government established religion compelled onto the general public, commonly referred to as sorcery. And that sorcery afflicting the general public, being barred by the gift of liberty, facilitates the ability to recover from the no fault addictions generated by having been captured by the ritual, creating the captured people's inability to escape simulation as they are harassed into compliance in accepting on eventualities such as Lindsay's references to the simulations created by the communists who acquire confessions from their civilian population that they are not loyal to the party, at which point it's not until the person is fully broken down that they aren't uh, legitimately a part of the party because of their crimes against the party, that they are allowed to be thrown out of society or redigested under more malicious restraints, at which point it is the same functional concept as in the Bible, as when a person takes out an evil spirit from himself, and the evil spirit, having gotten bored of being something that is roaming around the world, says to itself that I will come back and I will see whether or not my former home is available. And when they come back and they see it cleaned and swept and prepared, he says to itself, aha, I shall bring with me 7 other demons, more malicious than myself, and then I will ruin this person's life. At which point you understand that this is the basic function of the materializing abuses for the rituals, which is promised wealth in exchange for those abuse rituals at the service of the demons who are exponentially receiving their product's value, giving them the incentive under that theology to actively, permanently be able to at least defraud the person by the front investment that the services being traded is highly profitable for the permanent state of their future wealth, as they are paid to create the crime that somebody else is supposed to suffer and pay for, which facilitates the demonic hell society's standards and norms and customs and function, which the fraudulent status position exponentially increases the powers of the state to violate its own rules, locally, state, and federal, in order to increase the service of these positions at loyalty to the unitary executive theory at this service of their demonic overlords from the Nazi structure, which has exponentially existed and has been compounding in the research on how to sustain their system of abuse. As you begin to mature your understanding of their druidic functions, you begin to investigate certain aspects, such as the fact that the druids believe that if you cut off someone's head who was important, then you would then absorb the power of that person. So if there were like a prince or something, someone of high importance, then you absorbing all of that advantage um, would then demonstrate having presented their head for everyone in order to assert your dominance to the general public. At which point, if you have a type of situation of the Antichrist situation, which is the being someone who comes off into the world scene arbitrarily out of left field, not really expected or seen or understood by the general public throughout the world, a altogether otherwise insignificant person before the time that they are revealed all of a sudden, all at once, acquires all of the powers exclusively all at once, as though their powers from their title were owed to them and had been actively restrained or detained, facilitates the capacity of being able to restore the world back into order after the manufactured chaos, which includes their active military campaigns in destabilizing nations and fracturing its peoples, generating their civil wars and their skirmishes, and exponentially increasing the wars and the rumors of wars and the misery of the general public as they are punished with the existence of the satanic rulership by the wizard society. And that wizard hell society manufacturing the system, having in their reserve a prisoner to be released to solve all of their problems, could then, upon the checkpoint, receive the indicator for their cons to begin to start to cycle through, at which point their ability to recapture that person through a surveillance mechanism like nerve hacking or a Manchurian candidate, where they become some alternative form of mind control, but like it's, you know, they're in full control of the body, at which point they receive a fatal blow to the head that then allows them to absorb all of the powers of that prisoner, at which point the shell body of that Antichrist becomes the manifestation of, just a piece of ammunition for them. So the act of giving them permission to any of those functions is the permission or celebration or guarantee or protection or promotion of the end of the world according to Revelation, as your loyalties to the Gnostic Satan, the one world government God, is the thing that you would be establishing yourself as your functional religion by act of allowing them to conduct any of those operations, including the destruction of the sexuality, which facilitates the compulsion that the body of the Antichrist doesn't actively have sex with women, is a fundamental core identity feature, which is actively enforced by the Gnosticists, who would actively be managing the wizard circles, and their active ability to control the person for the extended period of time. Now, if the person has enough power in their title, then the assumption would be that they would have captured him from an extremely young age, at which point you have the manifestation of a child sacrifice and human trafficking, which requires them to conduct their ritual abuses against him without the executions or killings, which would be normally associated with threats specifically connected to that, at which point they would actively sell and distribute black market contracts to reinforce the various distractions on that, as people are systematically convinced of the delusion distractions by virtue of their alternative justification to their enforcement of the black market contracts, which is only possible by the control of the human traffickers generating the simulation from their control. The inability of the prisoner to escape is the function of being able to compel them into the simulation, as opposed to a free person who can just walk away from the conversation if they are no longer being able to have a viable influence in the conversation. A free person can just walk away, you're just being obnoxious, and fuck off. Uh, a prisoner, however, has no control over whether or not they're having the engagement or the conversation, at which point the perpetual abuse of the violence and harassment means whatever they're harassing the target with is the manifestation of the simulation, which is an alternative reality to the legal structure of the contract schedule, which would generate the owed value, which asserts their ability to be released all at once, which would be able to have the base value of the Antichrist, which they would seek to overtake by the spirit of Satan using their wizard, human trafficking, nerve hacking sensibilities, so that they, having a second party over them, can manufacture the Antichrist. Now imagine if you are that person themselves. You have a system of people who have overwhelmingly proven their criminal nature, at which point the wizards would have actively been targeting various groups in order to compromise them, in order to buy black market contracts, making them criminals under the terror factory operations, at which point the history of criminal operations from those groups would require the engagement or justification of retaliation by law enforcement, which, if you are giving them control over the government, they would be able to do. At which point, if you compromise a bunch of radicalized Nazis inside the churches, then you would actively be able to have the capacity to reinstate the biblical version of the Antichrist, hunting the church and having power over it in order to win, as the justification that they are discoverably criminal would actively remove their systematic defenses that they would have otherwise been able to maintain in a conflict on conflict type arrangement. If they are provably guilty, then they do not have the defense of law, at which point the old saying from Man for All Seasons, that you must give the devil his due in court and law, uh, they, in their self delusion, cutting a road through the law in order to get to the devil, would systematically have violated all forms of legal defense, at which point, when every last law was cut down and the devil has turned around on you, where would you hide from the devil? The law has all been flouted. They would not be able to stand the winds that would blow then, as it would be the just retaliation against known criminals in the system as public enemies, correctly, legally, and justly, in the eyes of all in the world, correctly and in order in the sight of heaven and earth. They are guilty, 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 and deserve to be pursued to the ends of the earth for their offenses that they are guilty of in their devotion to their self delusions of their ascension by their prognosis that their knowledge has asserted them the capacity to accelerate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that they too can become like God, finding out all too late that they are in fact not, by the tricks and subversions of being able to ascend by the virtue of their secret powers, their ability to obstruct justice in order to get to the devil by any means necessary, as the targeting processes from William Barr's unitary executive theory on pre-crime and other criminal functions of the fascist arrangement have specifically arranged for their capacity to engage in those functions of exponential compounding guilt, manifests the capability that once the devil has turned around on them, they shall then be destroyed by justice and competence, as the existence of those violations is the manifestation of your unrevocable guilt. And in that state of asserting your superiority, by asserting your fruit of the poison tree, by your frauds and your deceits and your tricks of the devil in order to catch the devil, you have proven yourself an enemy of society and an enemy justly of the state. And in the process of trying to pursue the devil in whatever mechanism or variation you would have been conceiving at the time, you in that part, doing whatever is necessary in order to course compliance of various states in order to compel slave raids without due process, manifest the actual ability to have created the devil you pursued in order to capture the devil. You made the devil manifest. Allowing for the control over the target creates the simulation, as the obstructions of associations and contract schedules and other free society functions is the act of being able to rewrite the schedule in favor of the human traffickers, which is functionally by definition a simulation. And that simulation of fraud is not submittable or usable as a legal function, at which point its obstruction is the obstruction of the legal observed values in favor of the compelled simulation. That simulation generated by the human trafficking of the XYZ targets being co-signed by any party is material guilt, requiring the systematic dismantlement of the simulation in favor of the restoration of the original values in order to create a state of innocence of non-compliance with the criminal simulation, at which point the aiding and abetting of the simulation merely requires you to engage in gross negligence to cover for the phantom selves in order to protect the function of the actions systematically being enforced, as the motives of the crimes for the simulation requires the silence and compliance, the public admission to discovery, or the public confession to the obstructed values in the crossover values for the significant parties in the general public. Acknowledging that they were obstructed from a first serious offer is the obstruction of associations and contracts and etc., which is the foundation of various possibilities, which generates the arbitrary aspect of the free market. The demanding of the restoration of those values is the act of condemning the simulation, which is the act of innocence. With the arrest of the KKK wizard terrorists engaging in the threats against the public, you have the disillusionment and systematic eradication of the simulation and the threats that are keeping people in compliance with this simulation, which requires national security and law enforcement to dissolve those powers into reinstating a law-abiding citizen function, at which point the legal order jurisdictions being restored facilitates the capacity to reinstate the arbitrary functions of the market past first serious offers, requiring the investigation and full due diligence of the obstructed values, which requires the material information of sending out the information from courts certified as valid functions of courts, acknowledging the suspicion of a warrant's criminal motive, such as the barring of the association or the contract, which the party should be able to reinstate their negotiations for, which would materialize the capacity of their ability to reinstate at the funding of the government the original market, materializing under David Bowles' brokerage system or other systems which would have existed for any other parties who have been targeted by these mechanisms for the human trafficking. At which point, the David Bowles or Legend of David company structure from the estimate in the original American system is an obstructed function and business engagement, which is essential to the American political landscape, as the aristocracy function is how many of the political members get elected, including presidents, at which point the mechanisms of sedition, of barring the legal functions of government, as they systematically dismantle offices of the government and materialize the public's non-awareness of those existences by the simulation of long-standing human trafficking, making them forget the functions that they would have known about, as to renormalize the social engineered position as the simulation becomes more reality than the law. This is the objective of the criminal operation, at which point the subversion of the objective is necessary for the law to reinstate its authority and gain officers that serve it, at which point, with the restoration of that brokerage, you have the full due diligence structure of their confession to the paper trading, which allows them to reinstate the platform of their thinking on how to reform the long-standing obstructed values of the free market as they make their settlements on the various platforms, which allows them to materialize the value owed to them in the systematically broader arrangements. So you start off simple and you become more complex, You solve the puzzles with the picture by, you start off with the edges and then you work your way inside, at which point the larger issues being settled allows you to become systematically more organized as it becomes more and more self-accelerating in its own affirmation the more you do it, at which point the act of more people being aware of it through the function of it being published into common entertainment from the higher contracts owed from the original estimate of the economy from the obstructed markets with David would have originally had the contracts of David engaging in the market as to have indicated reaffirmations of himself through the entertainment system, at which point that would have already been a status quo function of his contracts, which reinforces his presentation to the general public of his superiority through his propaganda network, such as his National News Corporation, at which point that being reinstated or the function of the military intelligence being reinstated facilitates the investigation of David's officers in the military police engaging in the full due diligence of dissolving the criminal intent by the Nazi wizards and other double agents would allow for the materialized structure become systematically more easily digested by the general public, at which point you would be able to diversify that into the other high priority targets, which may have several backup contingency operations for many of the same operations. So if one fails, they have 10 other backups, is a reasonable assumption, as they probably wouldn't be leaving anything to chance, as many of the ritual functions requires risking life and death situations which are out of their direct control, but the possibility of the person dying actively has to be a part of the ritual itself, such as the exponential vulnerabilities and strandingness, or the engagement of starvation, or the function of extreme weather, or whatever ritual function that they come up with their psychotic arrangements in their abuse simulation network. The militant targeting of personnel to be captured and trafficked for the war crimes holding of POWs without the right of habeas corpus, as is derived by the systematic pretext of the Holocaust being reconstructed in its various degrees, which, remember, the Holocaust was a state secret. The act of it happening, the act of it not just being the function of the illegal arrest of the members of the general public would actively be validated by the wizard cult using the excessive to non-remedy functions of military retaliations against targeted groups without cause, at which point these systems of fraudulent against against reason customs manufactures the status quo function of criminal intention which they seek to make permanent, at which point the function of holding them in military camps, in death camps, in black sites, etc., for the targeted removal of rights without justification allows for the infinite threat against all peoples, at which point the Hell Society systematically being able to be sold out exponentially has each person, man, woman, and child, brother versus sister, father versus son, daughter versus mother, selling each other out, neighbor against neighbor, rival against rival, alternative nonsense versus alternative nonsense, accelerating, uh, sports team versus sports team, actively ratting each other out under the systems, actively being matured, such as in the wars in the Middle East, such as in the War on Terror, where the system of cooperating with the government became means of alternative retaliations against their social others, at which point you have the material false confessions which is the objective purpose of the false arrest, as opposed to the function of engaging in any national security interest, at which point the arbitrary threat against the general public is the destabilizing of the psychology of the collective community, which is the act of conducting war against civilians, as it is psychological warfare against the civilian population to engage in these activities. This is the normal function of betrayal, and these uh, moments of evil, these cities of evil, these societies of evil, this hell cult society manufactures on purpose these types of situations of absolute increasing arbitrary functions to insurrectionist wizard anarchy, generating greater and greater illusions and collaborations and frauds in conspiracies against the arbitrary civilians as they all become felons from a non-felon society from false accusation and by the ginning up of fraudulent illusions in order to convict their rival, at which point the act of conducting the terrorism through a proxy tool would be a felony act of terrorism, and the act of the intimidation against the general public being a generic oppression, such as the white nationalist threats against the black community being a general oppression, is a consistent state of terror as a function of government, and that generates political and social and other hate crime functions, at which point the wizard society of the KKK is manufacturing its control over these jurisdictions, asserting complete dominance for their insurrections, at which point those corruptions into the Middle East facilitates the creation of black white nationalists or brown white nationalists, or whichever, because the act of them being subordinate to the superior order generates their function as an inferior agent or tool of that larger structure. So whatever they are is irrelevant because they are changing themselves from an individual into a tool of, and being a tool of is the entirety of the accusation, which would actively be ginned up in the position of destabilizing nations around the world in the arrangement of the trained coups of the CIA, which actively destabilize populations and overthrow governments, destabilizing democracies and establishing dictatorships. These functions are the function of the KKK wizard cult society of the white nationalists, or a Hale society. The Satanist cult requires arbitrary threats against the general public and extortions and hyperaccelerations on the basis of compliance with betrayal of your society, at which point you understand the base nature of the insurrectionist society is self-destructive. A house divided against itself cannot stand, and thus it must fall as a mechanism of war crimes against civilians is the status quo function of the enemy society.